Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be taking a look at a mono blue splashing the teensy tiniest little bit of white Throne of the God Pharaoh deck. So this is one that was voted on by the patrons, and it is Janktastic, which I'm sure is why it got voted for. So let's have a look at the deck. So what is Throne of the God Pharaoh? Well, Throne of the God Pharaoh is a legendary artifact for 2 mana. It says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. So the idea of this card, to build around it, is to essentially have as many tapped creatures as possible to deal as much damage as possible. So the way that we're going to be doing that is by using a very special card, one of my favourites in Duels, Rise from the Tides. Rise from the Tides is 5 and a blue for a sorcery speed. Put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield, tapped, for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. So the entire strategy of the deck is to mill the crap out of ourselves, play ourselves a Rise from the Tides, and hope we have a Throne of the God Pharaoh on the field at the time. So maybe we'll make 13 2/2s, something like that, when we get to the Rise from the Tides. So Throne of the God Pharaoh turns our Rise from the Tides into essentially a 6 mana, deal 13 to your opponent, and then when we get to untap, we can also swing in for lethal after that as well. That's the basic strategy of the deck. So if we go right to the beginning, this deck is running 22 lands so that we hit lands a lot less, essentially. We don't really want to flood out, we want to make sure that we're hitting all of our stuff. We do also have a fair few mana rocks in the deck as well, such as Pyramid of the Pantheon. So 1 mana artifact, it says pay 2 and tap it. Add 1 mana of any colour to your mana pool. Put a brick counter on Pyramid of the Pantheon. And then you can tap it to add 3 mana of any 1 colour to your mana pool. But you can only do this if you have 3 brick counters on the pyramid. So essentially you have to use the first ability 3 times before you can use the final one. But it essentially turns it into an extra 3 mana, which is a decent little bit of ramp. We don't tend to do a great deal during the game itself. We're mostly just milling ourselves, so if we've got a little bit of spare mana open, then we want to throw it into Pyramid of the Pantheon. There's also a nice little synergy with Pyramid and Dramatic Reversal as well. So Dramatic Reversal is a 1 and a blue instant speeds, untap all non-land permanents you control, so it untaps the Pyramid. So we could tap this for 3, pay the 2 on the Dramatic Reversal, so we're essentially floating 1 mana, and tap it again to add another 3 to our mana pool. So we can generate a little bit of mana that way as well. But it's mostly in here to ramp towards our Rise from the Tide, so we can do it a lot earlier. Also, if we can chain together Part the Water Veil, which allows us to take an extra turn for 6 mana. If we can chain that with Rise from the Tides, we actually get to play our tapped creatures, take an extra turn, untap, and swing with them. So we do want a lot of mana as well. It does have a fair bit of a benefit from ramping as well. But it's mostly in here to lower the land count, and it's also something we can grab... Oops. No, come back. It's also something we can grab with Whir of Invention. So Whir of Invention is 3 blue and X, instant speed. It has Improvise, but we'll get to that in a second. It allows us to search our library for an artifact with converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle our library. So for whatever we pay X for is whatever artifact we can search for. So we only ever want to do this for 2, essentially. So this is a 5 mana spell, essentially, but there are ways of making it a lot cheaper as well with the Improvise. So Improvise allows you to use your artifacts to help cast the spell, and each artifact you tap using Improvise allows you to pay an extra 1, essentially. So if we've got ourselves a Pyramid of the Pantheon and we can't pay that 2, we can actually just tap the Pyramid to generate 1 colourless mana, which might help us grab our Throne of the God Pharaoh, which is pretty sweet. So we've then got ourselves... I should mention as well, with Whir of Invention, we've in theory got 4 copies of Throne of the God Pharaoh and 4 copies of Pyramid of the Pantheon and 4 copies of Cultivator's Caravan if it comes to it. Cultivator's Caravan can allow us to crew and tap all of our zombies yet again. We'll get to that in a second though. We next have Jace, Vryn's Prodigy. So for 1 and a blue, we've got a 0/2 legendary creature. It has the ability to tap, draw a card, and then discard a card. And then if there's 5 or more cards in our graveyard, exile Jace and return him to the battlefield transformed under his own control. So if we manage to do that secondary ability, we get Jace, Telepath, Unbound. So he's a 5 loyalty planeswalker. His +1 allows us to give a single creature -2, -0 until the end of the turn. So it allows us to lock down a creature, essentially, and survive a little bit longer. So one of the things that this deck will struggle with, probably, is going to be aggro. So the more we can slow down our opponent, the better. The -3 is what we're really running Jace for. Allows us to cast an instant or sorcery from our graveyard, and if we do cast it like that, it gets exiled instead of going into our graveyard. So if we've been milling the crap out of ourselves with pieces of the puzzle, for example, we might have something in our graveyard worth recurring. Maybe we've actually got a Rise from the Tides in our graveyard, but no way to pull it back. Well, Jace is the way to pull it back then, and there's no extra cost associated with using that -3. So that allows us to get a Rise from the Tides out of our graveyard, but also maybe even get a dramatic reversal or, you know, pieces of the puzzle to mill ourselves even more, get more targets for Jace. His ultimate is -9. You get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, target opponent puts the top 5 cards of his or her library into his graveyard. So essentially every spell becomes a mill spell. You can win this way, I guess, but it's not the preferred strategy of winning. This is a damage-based win con. So you probably won't be using the ultimate, especially since if you get to the point where you have that kind of loyalty, you probably want to be minusing to use the extra cards in your graveyard to keep filling it, that kind of thing. We then have Thing in the Ice. So for 1 and a blue, 0/4 defender, Thing in the Ice enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters on it. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, which is 90% of this deck, remove an ice counter from Thing in the Ice. Then if it has no ice counters on it, transform it. And when you transform it, it turns into a 7/8 creature called Awoken Horror. Whenever this creature transforms, return all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands. So it's a mass bounce spell. Bounces our own stuff as well. So you've got to be a little bit careful. If you've managed to cast your Rise from the Tides, it will bounce your zombie tokens, so you've got to be very careful about that. But most of all, it's here to initially slow down our opponent with the 4 toughness, but later down the line, mass bounce, and it can even be a win condition as well. If you hit them for 7, for example, after the bounce, take an extra turn with Part the Water Veil, then you hit them for 14, and that might just do it as far as damage is concerned. But it's here mostly as the mass bounce to keep ourselves alive, to slow our opponent down. Dramatic Reversal, we've talked about this, but there is another strategy for Dramatic Reversal. So the downside of using Throne of the God-Pharaoh on this strategy is that it forces us into tapping our creatures, and that's not necessarily a good thing if we need to defend ourselves. So let's say we've just cast our Rise from the Tides, we've got all of our zombies, and we've got 2 mana open, but our opponent's presenting lethal to attack us on the swing back. So he swings in, we Dramatic Reversal, we untap all of those 14 zombies. We might even have some artifacts on the field like Pyramid of the Pantheon, so now we can generate 3 mana for a counter spell as well. So in response to a reactive kind of thing for that, maybe we've got a counter to back up there. So there are some uses to it. We're only running 2 copies though, because it is kind of hit or miss. I'm tempted to maybe go down to 1 copy, just as a sort of, it's good but not good enough all the time kind of thing. We then have Take Inventory. So for 1 and a blue sorcery speed, draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named Take Inventory in your graveyard. So the first time you cast it, you draw 1 card, so it replaces itself. The second time, it draws 2, then it draws 3, and so on and so forth. You can then flash it back and then draw extra cards as well based off of that. It will take it out of the graveyard, of course, so you've got to be aware of that. But this is mostly in here as a decent card draw spell that is really nice and cheap. But if we've been self-milling ourselves, then maybe the first time we cast Take Inventory won't just be the draw 1 card kind of thing. We might already have 3 in our graveyard, which means this is automatically going to draw us 3 extra cards instead. So we can get a lot of value depending on the number that are in our graveyard, so it really helps with our self-mill strategy. We then have 1 copy of Scribe of the Mindful. Only 1 copy because, as we mentioned, we want instants and sorcery in our graveyards, not really so much creatures and artifacts, so we had to cut down and be a little bit careful with our count there. But Scribe of the Mindful is a 2 and a blue, for a 2/2 creature with the ability to pay 1 and tap sacrifice itself and return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So, the applications for Scribe are as such. We can maybe use a Rise from the Tides yet again. We could maybe bring back Crush of Tentacles to bounce all of our opponent's stuff again. If they've destroyed our artifacts or we've accidentally self-milled both of them, we can maybe grab a Refurbish back. That kind of thing. So we can get back our artifacts, get back our instants with Scribe of the Mindful. That's why it's here. Next we've got Cultivator's Caravan. So for 3 mana, Artifact Vehicle. It adds 1 mana of any colour to its mana pool, so it kind of costs 2 in a really roundabout fashion. Works quite nicely with Dramatic Reversal as well, because that untaps it. So we can essentially make Dramatic Reversal only cost 1 mana with a Cultivator's Caravan out here, but the main reason to use it, other than the fact that it generates the white mana for our 1 white card, is the Crew ability. So you can tap any number of creatures you control with total power 3 or more. This vehicle becomes an artifact creature until the end of the turn. So you can imagine if we've used our Rise from the Tides, it's not quite killed our opponent. We've Dramatic Reversaled so that we can defend ourselves. And then we've got these zombies here. Maybe it's not lethal enough or our opponent's running fogs, that kind of thing. Well, we can use Cultivator's Caravan to tap absolutely all of our creatures yet again. And that will trigger Throne of the God Pharaoh for a second time around. So it's in here as a little bit of ramp, something to fetch with Whir of Invention if we already have our throne, and also as a tapping ability to essentially kill our opponent. So with a combo deck like this, we probably want to be able to protect our combo. So we're actually running a few counter spells here. We've got Scatter to the Winds, which is 1 and 2 blue for a hard cast counter, essentially just counters target spell, absolutely anything. So an Anguished Unmaking, trying to kill our throne. Maybe if they're fogging, we can counter that. There's all sorts of applications. Against a board wipe, we can stop them from taking our zombies off the board, which also might win the game for us right there and then. So there's lots of reasons why we want counters in here. We also have Awaken 3, so we can cast it for 6 instead, and put 3 1/1 counters on a land, and it essentially becomes a 3/3 with haste and can attack in. That might be relevant, that might not be. It's mostly in here for the hard counter, but I like the utility available nonetheless. So we've talked about Whir of Invention. We then have Hydrolash. So for 2 and a blue instant speed, attacking creatures get -2, -0 until the end of the turn. So this is not going to kill any creatures, but it may slow our opponent down to the point where they're probably swinging into us all the time. So we can actually almost entirely take most of their damage off for the most part, depending on what we're being hit against anyway. It's not targeted, so hexproof creatures still get hit by this, and depending on the number of creatures swinging in, it has more value. If it doesn't have any value though, it does cantrip as well, so we can actually just cast it for free, maybe to get another instant in our graveyard, which cantrips gets us maybe the land drop we need, maybe the Rise from the Tides that we're looking for, that kind of thing. We then have Pieces of the Puzzle. So for 2 and a blue, sorcery speed, reveal the top 5 cards of your library, put up to 2 instant or sorcery cards from among them into your hand, the rest into your graveyard. So with Pieces of the Puzzle, we're looking for our utility cards. Maybe if we're against aggro, we're looking for Hydrolash. Most of the time, we're looking for a copy of Rise from the Tides, maybe even a part of the Water Veil, that kind of thing. For everything that doesn't get milled as well, it puts artifacts in our graveyard. That's not ideal, but we can get them back with Refurbish, so we could grab a Refurbish if a Throne of the God Pharaoh got revealed and milled. We can also mill things like Glyph Keeper and use its Embalm instead, so we're not really losing any value per se from milling a Glyph Keeper, because we can get it back later from the graveyard. We can also use it with Drownyard Temples as well to pay 3 and return this from the graveyard to the battlefield, so we can use the lands that we hit occasionally to ramp ourselves, that kind of thing. So the things that we take are giving us advantage. The things that we don't take occasionally give us advantage, so it's really nice for that. We're not running too many copies of this because I don't want to self-mill the crap out of ourselves and get ourselves killed that way. That would be the downside. That being said, if we're against mill, not the worst thing in the world, because mill essentially puts all the instants and sorceries in our graveyard. We only need a Rise from the Tides and the mana, and we can probably kill our opponent by using their own strategy against them, essentially. Next we've got Insidious Will, so for 2 and 2 blue, instant speed, it's a utility card. First and foremost, it is a counter spell. It can also be used to redirect spells as well, so if they go with their Anguished Unmaking on our Throne of the God Pharaoh, we can redirect it to one of our opponent's things instead, and they lose 3 life and kill their own thing. So if they've got an Ulamog and they want to get rid of our Throne of the God Pharaoh, because it might win us the game, we actually redirect their Anguished Unmaking onto their Ulamog, and they pay 3 life and exile their own win condition, essentially. We can also use it in conjunction with all of our spells as well to copy a target instant or sorcery spell and choose new targets for the copy. So, if we have 10 mana, for example, which is really good with a Pyramid of the Pantheon, if we've been ramping up alongside our Dramatic Reversals and our Cultivator's Caravans and stuff like that, we can quite reasonably get to about 10 mana by the time we want to win. If we cast a Part the Water Veil for 6 mana, use Insidious Will for another 4 mana, so we need 10 mana, we can copy Part the Water Veil and actually take 2 extra turns after the one that we've currently taken. And if we've got anything on the board that's doing any kind of damage, maybe a Thing in the Ice at 7 points, 2 extra turns with an Awoken Horror, probably already not Summon Sickness to begin with, so that's 21 points of damage with a board that's likely cleared unless they're running horrors for some reason. So there's that nice little combo there. We can also use it to double up Rise from the Tides as well, so we get double the amount of zombies we normally would get, which might be enough to go over the 20 points with Throne of the God Pharaoh, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of uses for Insidious Will. It's protection, and it also boosts up our combo as well. We then have Hieroglyphic Illumination, so for 3 and a blue, instant speed, draw 2 cards. Pretty specific. That's all we really need it to do, but in the early game we can also use it to cycle as well, or maybe even in the late game for that extra zombie from our Rise from the Tides. So cycling allows us to discard it and draw an extra card in its place. So if it's too expensive in the early game, we get a redraw. If we want an extra zombie in the battlefield from Rise from the Tides, then we cycle, that kind of thing. But most of the time, we're going to be drawing some cards off of it at the very least. Running 3 copies of that because it is kind of top heavy and I don't want to run too many 4-drops. Next we've got Refurbish, so for 3 and a white, sorcery speed, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is a worst case scenario kind of card. It's not come up in anything just yet, but if our opponent's running maybe a lot of Reclamation Sages, or we've self-milled ourselves by accident, and essentially we've lost our win condition, then we need a way of getting it back, and Refurbish is the only way of getting back artifacts from your graveyard as it stands. I think there's a black and white card that does it as well, but that involves us splashing 2 cards. So we're running 1 copy of Refurbish, which we can actually grab with Scribe of the Mindful. We can actually pick up from a Pieces of the Puzzle, that kind of thing. And it allows us to get our artifacts back, essentially. Also, we generate the white mana using the Pyramid of the Pantheon. We use it during the Cultivator's Caravan, and we also run 2 Glacial Fortresses as well, just to make sure we have that white mana to cast it, just in case. So every single bit of mana that we would normally use to just hard cast this can also be used as blue mana as well. So we're not really losing any consistency by running a single copy of Refurbish. It's just there as an emergency situation kind of card. So next we've got Glyph Keeper. This is kind of an alternative win condition. It's really hard to deal with for our opponent. So it's a 3 and 2 blue, 5/3 flyer. So it's automatically got evasion and a 4-turn clock if your opponent can't deal with it. So Glyph Keeper essentially has a nice little shield on it as well, which means that if it becomes a target of a spell or an ability for the first time each turn, counter that spell or ability. So if your opponent goes to murder Glyph Keeper, it automatically gets countered. So our opponent has to waste 2 removal spells to get rid of Glyph Keeper. And even after he gets rid of it off the board, we can embalm it back for 7 instead of 5 and create ourselves a token copy of Glyph Keeper. And yet again, that comes back with this little shield which requires 2 removal spells, or maybe even a board wipe. And if it costs our opponent a board wipe to get rid of a Glyph Keeper, then that's just 1 board wipe that they're not using on our Rise from the Tides. So there's a lot of value here as well. But this is our alternative win condition if Throne of the God Pharaoh just will not work for us. So we talked about Part of the Water Veil. It's a 6 mana, take an extra turn. does get exiled, so we can't flash it back with Jace or return it to our hand with our creatures, our scribes. Can't do any of that. So once it's been used, it's gone for good. However, it can be used as an Awaken 6 as well. We can pay 9 mana, 6 and 3 blue, to put 6 1/1 counters on a land and give it haste. So we get an extra turn, it untaps as a 6, we get to swing at our opponent for 6 turns, as well as have an additional turn. So there's a lot of value there as well. Next, we've got Crush of Tentacles. So, as we mentioned, we need a lot of ways to protect ourselves, and Crush of Tentacles is one of those ways. So, for 6 mana, 4 and 2 blue, we get to return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If Crush of Tentacles' surge cost was paid, you get to put an 8/8 blue octopus creature token onto the battlefield. So, this is kind of an emergency button as well. We don't always want to be casting this if we've maybe got counters on our pyramid. Oops, because it will bounce our pyramid as well and we'll have to put the counters back on. So it's one of those panic button kind of situations. But we can cast a really cheap card and pay 5 for it and get ourselves an 8/8 to block with later down the line as well, which might be quite useful. But most of all, it's just completely wipe our opponent's board of everything. We can even use it to wipe our opponent's tutelages off the board and then hold up counters to counter them on the way back down, that kind of thing. So that's essentially the deck. As we mentioned, we've got 18 islands and we're running Glacial Fortresses for the refurbish. Glacial Fortresses over Prairie Streams because these come into play untapped simply by having an island in play. So 9 times out of 10, maybe 95% of the time, this is going to be an untapped land anyway. So it's better than running a Plains and it's better than running a Prairie Stream that requires 2 lands to be played, 2 basic lands more specifically. Before it comes into play untapped. So if we've got an island turn 1, Glacial Fortress comes into play turn 2 untapped. So there's really no downside to running a Glacial Fortress 9 times out of 10. We then have our Drownyard Temples. We've briefly touched upon these. They add colourless mana to your mana pool, but you can also pay 3 to return them from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So if your opponent milled you, or you milled yourself, you can actually pay 3 to ramp ourselves as well, which gets us closer to Rise from the Tides, that kind of thing. It's also a pretty decent discard fodder as well if it comes to it. Anyway guys, that's going to do it for the deck. If you do like the look of the deck, then be sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out the matches that should be following shortly, if not already out there. Do hope you enjoy, and if you did, hit the little bell icon as well and you'll get notifications when future videos like this go live. Do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.